So we saw into the 1950s this tremendous era, if you will, of Maoist socialism. As I said, Mao was a nationalist, and he was an anti-foreign nationalist. He believed in this notion of self-reliance, and what we saw in the post-war period, therefore, was a closed-door policy. China was not going to open its doors to the rest of the world, like we saw in Europe, like we saw in other parts of non-communist Asia and Latin America, and so on. And again, I want to stress this was a very popular refrain amongst the Chinese people. The party line at the time, the Chinese Communist Party line was, we will develop more, faster, better, and more economically. And they would do this by harnessing the people's energy, by harnessing this anti-foreign nationalism, and by harnessing this as yet unleashed energy for a revolutionary China. In 1956, the Chinese government released its 12-year plan. As with all Soviet or communist states, it has 12-year plans. And in this 12-year plan, there was a target that said in 12 years, agricultural production in China would increase by 185%. We now know that in some of the writings of Mao that he in fact believed that this could be achieved in as little as 7 years. And so as a result of this, we see a mini leap forward in which we see the collectivization of land, the creation of agricultural producers cooperatives. People would work together cooperatively. People would harness the energy of the peasants to raise the profile of this great nation. We would rely on people's revolutionary spirit for China to stand up on its own and in a self-reliant way. And in the first few years of this, in fact, production did increase. And in many ways, we can call this the sort of high tide of socialism. We now know that the increase in output, however, was a function of the increase in input. In other words, people just worked harder. They worked longer hours. They worked their land more exhaustively. You intensify inputs, you should expect greater outputs. We didn't see any gains in efficiency, but rather we just saw an absolute increase in output, and this was in many ways reinforced by the Maoist cult of personality. So it was around this time that Mao says, man, this is going pretty well. China is on the rise. The grand plan that he had put into place was working. The mini leap forward of the early 1950s through 1956 did create some economic growth, and Mao was getting a little confident. He was confident, as all autocrats are, that if he actually turned to the people now, he was quite confident that the masses would support him. After all, he was a great revolutionary. They won the Chinese Civil War, they pushed back the Japanese, they proclaimed the PRC, and we had seen some economic growth. And so he launches in 1956, 1957, the 100 Flowers movement, in which he says, let 100 flowers bloom, 100 thoughts content. Let 100 flowers bloom, 100 thoughts content. Right? Basically, he was opening up the system to allow the masses to criticize the party. To say, okay, you've had a little taste now. What can we do better? What can I do better? What can we as a government do better? Now, of course, no autocrat opens themselves up for criticism unless they believe that no one's going to criticize them. And Mao was this way too. He believed that by opening up the masses to say, let 100 flowers bloom and 100 thoughts content, he would expect everyone to say, don't worry about it, everything's going great. We're happy down here. Just keep doing what you're doing, and we're going to go on this irreversible stride to becoming a great Chinese nation. In other words, what we saw here was a potential democratic movement. He really believed that the 100 Flowers movement would reinvigorate the party, get everyone excited, and keep the revolutionary spirit alive. What happened, however, was that people actually took his offer kind of seriously. Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 thoughts content, and people actually began to say, well, it's true, things are better, It's great that we, are no longer under occupation by the Japanese. It's great that the corrupt Nationalist Party has been extracted and put into exile in Taiwan. But there is this thing called a little bit more political liberalization. Right? We want a little more political liberalization, and some critics even deign to use the term democracy. Others, in fact, said, well, actually, if you look at the data, economic growth has not actually been all that fruitful or robust. That, in fact, we're not, as a nation, producing more because we're more efficient. We're only producing more because you're making us work harder. We're not exactly happy about that as well. Well, Mao, as you can imagine, interpreted this as an attack against socialism, as an attack against his regime. And as he himself said, all words and actions that depart from socialism are completely distinct. So, just as soon as he opens the 100 Flowers movement and says, please criticize the party, he comes down hard on what he calls the anti-Rightist campaign. Just a few months after the 100 Flowers movement was launched, Mao then claims that all dissenters to the regime are quote-unquote counter-revolutionary, and they are bourgeois revisionists. And so in the late summer of 1957, we see the anti-Rightist campaign launched by the Chinese Communist Party, in which we see hundreds of thousands of critics purged, jailed, or killed. You can imagine now, after the 100 Flowers movement and the subsequent anti-Rightist campaign, Mao finds himself in a bit of a conundrum. In one sense, his authority had been questioned. Maybe he's not making the right decisions for China. Maybe this type of socialism is not really in our long-term interests. Worse yet, his patriotism had been questioned. If there was anything that Mao staked his prestige on, it was on his love of nation. It was on his patriotism. It was on his revolutionary credentials. So Mao felt that he needed to re-energize the masses again. Needed to give a heavier dose of this anti-foreign nationalism, give a heavier dose of this myth of self-reliance, and a much heavier dose of what he thought to be scientific socialism. So in 1958, he launches the Great Leap Forward, which, if you've been following, is the subject of several new books now in which new evidence has been unearthed about what exactly happened during the Great Leap Forward of 1958. The first characteristic, or the first feature of the Great Leap Forward, was the formation of communes. As I pointed out, in the early 1950s, agriculture had been collectivized. In other words, all people worked the same land collectively. Land tenure and land ownership was abolished. The commune system was a step further. Now we saw not only work teams working together collectively in the field, but all forms of social, economic, and political life were communized, from cooking to childcare, from farming to industry, centered around the commune. So any notion of individual incentives or individual effort, or even any sense of individualism within the neighborhood or the village, had become erased as it was centered around the commune. The second feature of the Great Leap Forward were what we now call the steel furnaces. According to Mao, the great advantage of the commune system was that people would work collectively. That if you worked collectively in the fields, in agriculture, then you would increase production. And if you worked collectively and cooperatively in these commune systems, no one would ever starve. Because if your yield was higher, someone else within your commune would be able to share. There was this communal logic to production. Mao believed that this was also the case with respect to industrialization. And so quite unlike the path of industrialization that we see in other societies, industrialization in China in the 1950s was centered in the communes. And more specifically, the core focus of industrialization was going to be steel. Every great nation had to have steel. That's why the Chinese lost the Opium War in 1842. That's why the Chinese couldn't defeat the Japanese in 1895. And that's why the Chinese Communist Party had a hard time defeating the Nationalist Party in the Chinese Civil War. Every great nation had to have steel. In 1957, steel production in all of China measured a measly 5.4 tons. In the Great Leap Forward plan, it was set that by 1959, just 5 years later, or 2 years later, steel production would go from 5.4 tons to 30 million tons. By 1962, 100 million tons. And by the mid-1970s, over 700 million tons. In other words, under Mao's plan of the Great Leap Forward, China would be overtaking U.S. steel production in less than 10 years. And remember, this is a nation that has no steel industry at all and was producing a measly 5.4 tons in 1957. The question was how? How was China going to make steel? And how was China going to produce steel that was going to rival the U.S. steel industry, which was the world's largest at that time, in under 10 years? Well, the answer for Mao was in the Communes. We're not going to have integrated steel mills. We're not going to have modern technology. We're going to create a steel industry through the energy of the peasants and the masses. And we're going to do it through small-scale production and through hard work. And if you need to, and we now have historical records of this being the case, if you need to, smelt your own pots and pans to increase our output. As you can imagine, the endeavor failed. And if you're smelting your own pots and pans, you're not going to have, in any sense, industrial-grade steel to use. The third feature of the Great Leap Forward was state-owned enterprises. Industry was going to be state-owned. Production targets were set by the state. Wages were set by the state. There were no bonuses, no incentives, and no foreign technology. In other words, these firms were industrial dinosaurs the moment they were set up. The Great Leap Forward proved to be a developmental disaster. In fact, now, according to some authors, inside China, an example of one of the worst developmental disasters in all of modern history. Because the Great Leap Forward and the ambitious goals of the Great Leap Forward were dependent on the energy of the masses, there were no efficiencies in this economic system. If you work 5 hours a day, you produce 5 units of output. If you work 10 hours, you produce 10. And if you work 15, you produce 15. So work 15 to triple our output. There are no efficiency gains in this kind of economic system. It was a developmental disaster because it was completely market disregarding. There were no incentives to work hard, and once people began to be tired of this notion of the energy of the masses, or just simply physically tired, there were no other incentives to continue to increase productivity. Third, there was absolutely no openness to foreign technology. You have these ridiculous plans to create a steel industry that would overtake the United States in less than 10 years, and this was to be based not on technology, but rather to be based on smelting your own pots and pans. And fourth, it was a developmental disaster because the Great Leap Forward was completely, in China more generally, was completely disengaged from the global economy. There was no economic trade external to China, no market signals, and also no access to foreign capital. In the end, it's believed, in many circles this is considered to be a conservative number that understates the reality. It's believed that over 30 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. As you can imagine, with the death of 30 million, and this isn't the death of 30 million due to political persecution, this is simply people starving. You can imagine with the death of 30 million people, that's the size of Canada, dying in the Great Leap Forward, there was some resistance growing against Mao within the Chinese Communist Party. There was some sense that maybe this isn't the right way to go. That maybe all of that revolutionary fervor and that talk of self-reliance in 1949 is beginning to lose its luster, as we see 30 million of our compatriots die. This then led to the Cultural Revolution and what would be known as China's 10 lost years. But I want to stress that in 1962, we saw yet another moment for potential democratic opening. That Mao's legitimacy had waned so incredibly far that there might be an opportunity, at least in retrospect, for there to have been a democratic opening. Indeed, in the early 1960s, we begin to see a split within the Chinese Communist Party leadership. There were those on the one hand, although increasingly small, who really continued to believe in Mao. But there was a larger group within the Chinese Communist Party that recognized the disaster that was the Great Leap Forward and increasingly marginalized Mao and increasingly offered an alternative vision to Maoist socialism. So Mao, in a last-ditch effort, you can see images of the Cultural Revolution in any fifth-generation Chinese cinema film. Mao tries to re-energize the masses one last time, to rejuvenate that revolutionary spirit. You know, in one last-ditch effort in 1966, Mao begins to attack his opponents in the party. Those that had begun to marginalize him, Mao goes on the offensive, labels them counter-revolutionary, claims that they had been poisoned by bourgeois elements. Interestingly enough, this is also the period in which we see many of China's eventual leaders marginalized within the party. Mao, as a last-ditch effort to launch this offensive within his own party, allies with the army, and he allies with students, young people, the great nationalists of any great nation. And these young people, of course, were the Red Guards. And Mao, again, with his revolutionary credentials, with the myth and the Maoist cult of personality, calls on young people to launch a cultural revolution. To launch a revolution from within society, from the bottom up, to say to young people, you are the exploited. Your parents and your teachers and your professors and your workplace leaders have all been poisoned by these bourgeois elements. And it's incumbent upon you, therefore, then, to rise up in a mass movement, a cultural revolution, to destroy what Mao called the Four Olds. To destroy old customs, to destroy old habits, to destroy old culture, and to destroy old thinking. On one level, the Cultural Revolution was to rejuvenate the masses through the energies of young people, through their patriotism and nationalism. On another level, it was to eliminate Mao's rivals within the Chinese Communist Party. In the end, the Cultural Revolution was nothing but anarchy. This was not a top-down form of suppression. One has to remember that. This wasn't the Chinese state ruling with the iron fist and suppressing society. This was really a bottom-up revolution in which we saw bottom-up destruction. Where students and young people would turn their parents in. Where students would turn their teachers in. Where workers would turn their workplace leaders in. It's believed in the end that about 3 million people died in the Cultural Revolution, not at the hands of famine and natural disasters as we see in the Great Leap Forward, not as a result of starvation because of poorly planned economic models. But 3 million people died at the hands of the Red Guards and at the hands of the military. You can imagine the economy grind to a halt in these 10 years between 1966 and 1976, and the Cultural Revolution really doesn't end until 1976 with the death of Mao. The Cultural Revolution now, and again, this is common knowledge. You can ask anybody in China, what is the other name for the Cultural Revolution? It's otherwise known as the 10 lost years. That at this moment, when the rest of the world was developing, modernizing, growing economically, China had turned itself inward. And through the Cultural Revolution experienced what they now understand as the 10 lost years. The Cultural Revolution was a disaster. Most Chinese now, today, would say the developmental policies of the 1950s through to the end of the Maoist regime were a disaster. As the party, the Chinese Communist Party now today begins to prepare its documents for the leadership transition and how it thinks about the future of China, there is in fact no reference to Mao any longer in those documents. So think back to 1976. We would expect a democratic revolution. Look around at the analogous cases. We see corrupt regimes all around the world experiencing major legitimacy crises. And when we see this, we see people rising up, and we see the potential for a democratic revolution. We saw in the case of China, the breakdown of the state. We see within the Chinese Communist Party an elite split. We see increasing discontent in Chinese society. We see in 1976 to 1978 the emergence of the democracy wall, where students in Beijing began to protest and began to demand greater political freedoms and an eradication of the Maoist legacies. And yet, we don't see a democratic revolution. One way in which we think about the prospects for democratization in China is to understand it through the lens of modernization theory. Modernization theory is probably the most dominant, if also most maligned, political economic theory in the West about how societies modernize and transform over time. Modernization theory is very simple. It basically argues that a society undergoes stages of development, and that these stages of development are linear, that these stages are sequential, and that in many ways one stage leads to the next. So as societies economically modernize, we see the movement from agriculture to industry. We see the movement of people from the countryside into urban centers. We see the transformation of feudal arrangements to markets. Peasants becoming workers, becoming middle class. Increase in literacy, property rights. And the argument, therefore, that is societies, all societies modernize. As they modernize economically, as they modernize socially, as they modernize attitudinally, they will all eventually evolve into a democracy. It's inevitable. Or as Amy Nathan puts in the piece you read this week, the impermanence of authoritarianism. Eventually, modern societies, economically and socially modern societies, that picture of Shanghai I showed you today, eventually become a democracy. We expected this in China in many ways. After the disaster of the Maoist regime, we see Deng Xiaoping rise in power in 1978. And he's really considered to be the founding figure of China's modernization. And here we see basically what he calls the four modernizations. The modernization of agriculture. So we're not going to have this commune system anymore. We're going to create more market incentives. We're going to see the modernization of industry. And by modernizing industry, we're going to create more incentives for workers. We're going to open up foreign trade and the discipline of global markets. We're going to create special economic zones. We're going to develop the private sector and so on. 3, you see the modernization of national defense. And with the modernization of national defense, China would no longer be closed to foreign technology, but now it will open its arms to technology. And thirdly, to modernize science and technology. We're not going to make steel by smelting our pots anymore. We're going to take in foreign direct investment. We're going to expect technological spillover and all those other good things that supposedly come with modernization. So we would expect with China, as it modernizes economically and socially, that it too will become a democracy. Take a look at this here. You can see here China's GDP during the Maoist period. Not so impressive. You see here in 1978 the beginning of the four modernizations. The modernization of agriculture, the creation of a special economic zone in 1979 in southern China, and the modernization of industry, science and technology, and so on. And of course the rest is near recent history in terms of China's economic growth. So again, just to give you a sense, this is China under Mao, this is China since it opened up and launched the four modernizations. Here we can take a look at foreign direct investment. As you can see here, FDI by the mid-2000s is about $60 billion. This is inward FDI, excluding financial investment, so that's basically the circulation of currency. This is foreign direct investment in the movement of actual investment in firms, in China. We see a little dip after 08, of course, with the global economic crisis, but nonetheless, you begin to see really around 2000, China hitting the $60 billion mark with respect to foreign direct investment. Just to put that into perspective, in 1978, the amount of foreign direct investment into China, 1978, was zero. Not 10, not 100, it was zero. By 1980, between 1984, FDI into China was about $2 billion. So after 1984 to 2000, you go from $2 billion to about $60 billion. So essentially, we do see China's modernization. We see China's rapid economic modernization. We see a Chinese society increasingly urban. We now see the unleashing of a housing market which has increased the importance of property rights. Literacy is on the rise in China. You read Larry Diamond's piece on liberation technology. We know that Chinese citizens are wired. We know that there is a thickening of the middle class in China. In other words, China meets all of the structural requirements of modernization theory. In other words, according to modernization theory, we should expect to see democracy. And yet, as critics of the Chinese regime have largely pointed out, we do not see the fifth modernization. We do not see democracy. Okay, so we've got the rise of Mao, we have China's modernization. We also have, in and around this time, another democratic opening, the globalization of democracy. In 1989, as the students were mobilized in Tiananmen Square in Berlin, in Beijing, we see at the same time, around the same time, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we see French Fukuyama proclaiming the end of history. It was around this time that we see the third wave of democratic transitions in global history. The first wave in the 19th century, the second wave with decolonization in the post-war period, and then this wave into the 1970s and 1980s, in which we see massive movements in democratization in Latin America, the former Soviet Union, and Asia. And Sam Huntington, in remarking on the third wave of democratic transitions, pointed out that it was inevitable that other places would become a democracy because of the contagion effect. Right? Democracy in its globalized form was contagious. And as China's neighbors became democratic, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, which was already a democracy, Indonesia, Thailand, as its own neighbors became democratic, it would be contagious, and China itself would have to become democratic. It was also around this time, in the late 1980s and 1990s, that we see the rise of the human rights discourse. Before the 1990s, things like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, things like this, people are paying attention to it. Even though they're drawing on the same documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the post-war period, it wasn't until the 1990s that human rights became a global agenda. It's also around this time that we see the rise of democracy promotion and making democracy and democratization as part of our own foreign policies. Here in Canada, for instance, We are considered one of the champions of making foreign